and welcome to another edition of Trader Talk TV. Today we've got Brian Murphy from Duration in the office. Brian, how are you doing?
I'm good, Kieran. How are you doing?
Good. Today we're going to talk about this sort of intersection of sustainability and digital advertising, and Brian has come into the office to go through that. Before we do that, Brian, let's talk a bit about yourself and a bit about Duration Media, please.
Sure. So I've been in ad tech for almost my whole career. Since almost the very beginning. I was at DoubleClick back when it was a tiny little startup, and have worked at a whole bunch of companies throughout the programmatic ecosystem, and just been working with Duration Media since early this year, and I'm now their global CRO.
Very good. And we'll go into a bit about Duration Media and what it does with the publisher side in a few minutes. But we'll talk about sustainability first, Brian. We had our Attention conference yesterday. It was a big subject. At the end of the day, you sat in the panel discussing it. Why is it such an important topic right now for the digital advertising space?
It's a good question. We weren't talking about this subject 2 years ago, and suddenly it's arguably one of the most talked about topics in our industry.
Yeah.
And I think it's a good and fair question to ask, why is that? And so you have to go back about 2 years ago when a few research studies were done that asked the question, what is the carbon footprint or the environmental impact of the digital economy? So the research that was done looked at the whole digital economy, the entire internet. That includes gaming, crypto, email, streaming, and of course, digital advertising, which is the engine that powers the free and open internet. And what those studies told us was that the number is about 3.7%. That is the digital economy's contribution to global greenhouse gas emissions.
Wow.
Now
that's a big number.
It's a big number, right? Because you got to look at all the other industries from all the different sectors. You think of agriculture, you think of construction, you think of the fashion industry.
Yeah. Auto,
certainly. But the digital economy is responsible for a pretty sizable chunk of that number, and that's about the same as the commercial aviation industry. And that's where we start to realize, okay, we actually are part of the problem. Previously, we just probably weren't aware. We're a services and technology industry largely. We don't have factories, we don't have warehouses, we don't have delivery vehicles. But because we have data centers and CPU that is largely powered by what's called location-based emissions that come from purchased electricity, that's how you connect the dots between our industry and its impact on the environment.
Yeah.
But then it's also important to point out, like, okay, we know that that's our contribution, but what does it mean to us in the ad tech sector?
Yeah.
And so the next thing you got to look at is there's an organization called SBTI. That's the Science Based Targets Initiative. That is a partnership between a bunch of nonprofits from the World Resource Institute, the UN Global Compact, the WWF, an organization called CDP, which is one of the leading emissions data registries. And they all got together and formed an organization that is focused on helping companies set and validate their science-based targets. So a science-based target is when a company says, we pledge to reduce our carbon emissions at the scope 1 direct and then indirect scope 2 and 3 levels by a certain percent by a certain year in the future. And you have to go through some pretty serious standards and protocols in order to actually set and validate your target. And for it to be a science-based target, it's also got to be in line with the global campaign to cap global warming at 1.5 degrees Celsius.
Yeah.
And so for a company to go through that process, it's a pretty big deal, and it means that they're serious about climate action. The reason why that matters to us in ad tech is because if you look at the top 25 biggest spending brands in the world, 17 of them are in the SBTI database. That means that 17 of the top 25 biggest brands in the world, that's the P&Gs, the Unilevers, the Walmarts, they've all set a science-based target and had it validated by SBTI. Then you look one level down to the agencies. We know that there are 7 global agency holding companies. 5 of them are in the SBTI database. That means that 5 of the big global holding companies have gone through this pretty rigorous process to say that we're taking climate action seriously and we're going to reduce our emissions by a certain percent by a certain time in the future.
Yeah. What is sort of the Duration Media sort of perspective on this? Because obviously there's lots of stuff around these figures. We've heard them from various people in the industry. But so as a vendor in the space and an interesting player in the space, what is your company's perspective on it?
Sure. So first off, I think it's important to point out that there's sort of 3 things to think about when you're looking at any climate action strategy. And it's the 3 pillars of measure, reduce, remove.
Right.
Okay? And first off, on the issue of measure, that is when a company or a product or an organization basically conducts what's called a greenhouse gas inventory. That's when you look inward and you try to quantify what is the environmental impact of this asset, whether it is a company or a product or a service or whatever. And then you look for ways to reduce it after you've measured. And then removal is investment in carbon removal projects
Yeah.
or offsets to compensate for whatever the measured emissions are after you've reduced it as much as possible.
Yeah.
So I think it's important to point out, first off, that Duration Media focuses on products that reduce. We're not in the emissions measurement business.
No.
And we're not in the offset business. We really want to zero in on what we think is the most important piece.
Taking that out of the
Is
equation.
let's reduce where we can. There's plenty of companies out there that are providing with emissions measurement, particularly now in media. And we've got several organizations from the Ivy Tech Lab to the Global Alliance for Responsible Media that are working on a standard. And obviously AdNet Zero, the other nonprofit within the space, are all focused on coming up with a standard. So we're all measuring the same way and we're playing off the same playbook.
Right.
But we want to be building products that actually reduce emissions within media while still adding advertiser value and helping publishers with revenue and yield, because we're always trying to think of making sure that both sides of the
So
equation.
this is sort of a neglected area of ad tech. Well, we've seen the measurement companies, and there's quite a few of them. The removal, the actual sort of application of technology to remove or to reduce carbon footprint isn't really there in the space.
Well, here's what I'd say. I think there's a lot of focus on measurement first, and then using measurement tactics to create buying paths that have a estimated lower emissions than like previously. And that would be things like identifying publishers that might have too many unnecessary ad integrations, or
Yeah.
too long of an ads.txt file, or
Yeah.
too many ads on the page.
Yeah, SPO effectively.
It's basically a new approach to SPO, absolutely. And there's plenty of that happening. Think of that as we're trying to find better shipping lanes to make the transfer of data more efficient. We're trying to make the shipping containers more efficient. We're
Yeah.
actually looking at a campaign level and asking the question, how can we make this campaign be greener, be lower emissions, while still being impactful for both advertisers and helping publishers generate revenue?
Yeah.
I think it's also important to point out, though, that Duration Media is also a company that wants to walk the walk. And so we talked about all these other major brands and agencies that are taking climate action. That means that they're conducting greenhouse gas inventories at the corporate level. They're making big plans and implementing strategies to reduce. Duration Media is on a journey of its own. We just finished our 2022 greenhouse gas inventory, and it's currently being verified by an accredited third party, which
Okay.
is something we think every company in the industry should be doing.
Yeah.
But if we're going to be in the business of coming up with new innovative solutions around low carbon ad products, we want to make sure that we're a company that's
Yeah.
got a real climate action
Yeah.
plan in place.
Okay.
So your question was, like, how do we look at it? What's our perspective? Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so we really focus on data waste.
Yes.
All right, and I think everybody who works in programmatic can agree that there's no shortage of data waste. All right, lots of tech platforms transferring data back and forth in milliseconds, all so that you can see that ad on that page at the right time for the right user every time. We know that there's a lot of waste there. So when we look at data waste, we try to zero in on a couple of key areas. And so the three things that we're looking at are, number one, bid requests. We know that there is a high volume of bid requests required just to serve up a single impression. And we'll dive into that in just a minute. Then we got cookie syncs, right? Not to mention all those bid requests. Now there's all the cookie syncs to make sure that we're reaching the right audience. And then the third thing, which is really at the heart of everything that we think about at Duration Media, is non-viewable ads. And so we wanted to really dive into those three categories and try to understand them, try to quantify them, and then really think about how we can create innovative solutions to start to tackle these things.
Yeah.
So we went to our friends at Jounce Media and
Right.
said, you guys would be a good resource for this. How many bid requests does it take to serve up a single ad impression? And the answer is nobody really knows, right? Because the variables are just too far and wide with resellers and hops, and it's too complicated. But we came up with a pretty good average number that I think we've all agreed on, and it's probably, if anything, a little bit conservative. But if you assume that there are about 27 SSPs working with about 20 DSPs, that gets you about 540 different instances, 25% of which equal a bid. So that gets us to the magic number of 135 bid requests. That's the magic number that we're going for.
Per
135 bid requests just to serve up one programmatic display ad impression.
Jeez.
Okay? That's a lot of data waste.
Yeah.
Now, when the IAB Tech Lab Sustainability Playbook came out in June of this year, they gave us another number, which was 69.7 cookie syncs per page load.
Right.
And then on non-viewable ads, we know that conservatively, 30% of ads are never seen by an actual user.
Right.
So let's zero in on the 135, because that's the number that we really think we can start to unpack and start to understand and start to build products around tackling that number in a way that's still going to drive advertiser value and help publishers out.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right.
So those are big numbers, and obviously you need a product to kind of tackle that. And there's not too many. I want to talk about how you guys are building to address that problem, because it is a huge problem. I mean, when you start sort of mapping out those numbers and sort of, you know, scaling them up, it becomes a massive problem. I see how we can get to that 3.7% pretty easy up with that, with those numbers alone, because how many impressions are are served on a daily basis. Jesus, like billions, trillions, who knows. I want to talk about the duration product and how you built a product that attacks that problem head on.
Sure.
Right? So let's talk a little bit about how your stack works, and how it sort of works with publishers and works with the general industry to kind of like tackle this problem head on.
Okay, so the first thing you got to know is that there is the Duration Media core product, which is a technology called VAS. And VAS is Viewability as a Service.
Yeah.
And that is patented technology
Yeah.
that allows a publisher to have the ability to read viewability in real time.
Right.
So what it's able to do is know what percentage of the pixels of the ad are in view and for how many seconds.
Yeah.
Which is of great value to publishers who are trying to curate highly viewable impressions. This is a solution that is designed to help them do that, and there are over 400 publishers that are using VAS technology right now.
Right.
Over the past 15 months, Duration Media has been working on an extension of that, and that product is called Sequency, also a patented trademark product.
Yeah.
So here's how Sequency works. It's built off of the VAS technology, and it allows us to work with a publisher, okay? And the publisher will have its single ad on page.
Yeah.
Now the publisher will set everything up in GAM, if that's their ad server.
Fair ad server,
right?
yeah.
And for about 5 to 7 minutes, they're going to do a very simple setup.
Yeah.
So that the next time that they win a bid and serve an ad, that ad is going to be wrapped with the Sequency technology.
Right.
Which means that we can now read the viewability metrics of that ad in real time. We know how many pixels are in view, what percentage of pixels are in view, and for how many seconds. So Sequency allows us to set some dials to determine how do we define a viewable ad. So for example, we might say that we want 90% of the pixels to be in view for, let's say, 10 seconds.
Yeah.
And obviously that can be changed depending on how we want to set those dials. The first ad is served up. That's ad number 1. And we now, because we've got the ability to read viewability in real time, we can serve a second ad to that same targeted user on the same page. But if this ad required 135 bid requests, this one already knows the winning SSP, so there's only 1 bid request.
Ah, okay.
So we just served up a second ad to the same user without the need for additional bid requests
because you know what the parameters of the buy is.
Correct.
Right, okay.
So lots of publishers are using refresh technology. You could look at this as just a better way to do refresh because you're not running a new auction. And so if that ad is in view, 90% of its pixels for 10 seconds, again, using those metrics as the example, we can serve up a third ad, and we can serve up a fourth ad. Only if the previous ad meets those viewability criteria. So these are all going to be highly viewable impressions served up to a very targeted user, but we're not going to have the unnecessary data transfer, electricity use, and subsequent carbon emissions that come from all that additional.
And you're
programmatic
increasing yield by being able to serve ads in that sort of session that the user is there, basically.
Well, this publisher now has just created 3 new impressions without the unnecessary bid requests and related emissions. Yeah, that is incremental inventory for the publisher to sell, and they can sell it at a premium because it's got to meet those viewability metrics in order for those impressions to exist in the first place.
Yeah.
So this could be used from the buy side to do things like sequential messaging. So a advertiser might want to run a high impact video ad on this first impression.
Yeah.
We work with Seen This. Seen This has got fantastic streaming video technology that dramatically reduces the file size. So you've got a different type of emissions reduction happening with the use of Seen This. But you can run a high impact video in an ad unit number 1, and then a display ad with like product information, and then maybe a call to action in ads 3 or 4. But it starts to become a great use of sequential messaging. There's lots of different use cases for it, but it serves the advertiser by creating highly viewable impressions, and it serves the publisher in actually creating incremental inventory. So question we get a lot is, okay, but like how do we calculate the emissions reduction? This looks like it's definitely driving efficiency. It certainly drives advertiser value, but how do we make this into a case for a lower carbon ad product? And that's where we got to do some basic mathematics. So we need a few numbers in order to run those calculations. Now, the first thing we know is that we've got the 135 bid requests, right? Just to serve up one impression. But the question is, what's the carbon impact of an impression? And we went and looked at some of the studies that have been done out there, and there's a Scope 3 Sustainable Advertising Report from Q2 that has a number that seems to be pretty widely adopted, which is 255.1 grams of CO2 equivalents per 1,000 impressions. So that's sort of like your green CPM, if you will.
Okay.
Work with me here. So now we got to figure out what's the carbon impact of a bid request. Well, you got to use these two numbers, and guess what? It comes out to be a pretty low number. It's 0.00188 grams of CO2e per bid request. Tiny number, but we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of millions of bid requests just to serve up a few campaign impressions. And that's where we've dialed in on trying to really quantify the problem and figure out if we can start to lower these numbers and then look at it at a macro perspective. Are we contributing to the decarbonization of the digital economy?
Yeah. Is there any way for us, and this might seem like a stupid but obvious question, you still have to have the 135 here,
Yes,
right?
great question.
And then you've got this, if you do, you're just adding another 111 onto it. So this is actually increasing your overall carbon footprint. So how do we get this count down, the initial count down, or is there a way to do that?
That's a great question. First off, with so many publishers already refreshing their ads, we're just basically giving them an alternative to the traditional methods, where instead of running a new auction every time they refresh the ads, we're giving them a way to refresh the ads without the additional
Okay, so generally speaking, they would refresh the page, and the bid auctions would start all over again.
When the new
so you could be
start.
actually looking at 135, 135, 135, 135 here, basically.
Exactly. In fact, that's how we run the comparison to show what is the actual impact of the sequencing campaign.
Right, okay.
So let's do what we call a comparison, and we need to have a baseline. Anytime you're doing any kind of measurement in the world of emissions, you need a baseline. So we ran a bunch of tests, and one of the test examples showed us that if we delivered on the impressions front 1.6 million impressions, how many bid requests did that require? And then what were the subsequent emissions associated with that? So the bid requests, and that turns out to be 216 million bid requests just to serve up 1.6 million impressions, okay?
Wow.
It's a lot of bid requests.
Yeah.
Now, if you use our math over here, it actually comes out to about 406,000 grams of CO2 equivalent. So that's the carbon footprint of a 1.6 million impression campaign. That's our baseline. That's what a typical standard programmatic display campaign.
Do we have any idea what the equivalent of this would be like, just driving your car around for a couple of days, or
we have, there's all sorts of tools out there that's like how many cell phones is that being fully charged?
Yeah,
how many flights to Chicago is that?
Yeah, that could be quite interesting. Flights to Chicago.
Yeah, I don't
or to
have
New York, because it's on Tech Central, like.
Well, I mean, to be clear, this is grams of carbon, so I mean, we're dealing with metric tons of carbon. We're talking about flights, but
I mean, 1.6 billion is just a blip on the entire sort of media buying, selling ecosystem.
Right. Well,
I mean, that starts to start
this is
calculating.
a tiny ad campaign.
Yeah. yeah. So it starts calculating up. It starts accumulating pretty aggressively when you start. Because like you never really think about these numbers, right? You hear stuff and like then it becomes like so obvious. Like 3.7% of the total carbon output every year. That's pretty significant.
Yep.
It's a really significant. That's like having like 100 power stations is pumping out like carbon dioxide from these chimneys, like maybe even thousands, like.
Well, there's another question we get oftentimes, which is, okay, like these are pretty substantial numbers, but on the grand scheme of things, advertising is still 3.7%.
Yeah.
That's a big number, but we don't compare it to some of the other industries that are much heavier when measured by emissions. But a good way to look at it is that if you're walking down the street in your neighborhood and you see a Foster's can on the sidewalk, you pick it up because it's the right thing to do, not because you're going to save the planet.
Civic duty there.
Okay, well, but
people
think of ad tech as our neighborhood, right?
Right.
Like we're doing every company, big or small. I mean, Duration Media is not we're not a Meta, we're not an Amazon, we're not a Google, but we still went through the process of not only coming up with innovative solutions around this, but we also made sure that we were, running our own emissions inventory because big or small, it doesn't matter.
So how do you have a number in terms of like when people use your technology, how the kind of reduction you see in overall?
Well, let's compare this baseline to a sequencing campaign, right? So if we do a sequencing campaign and we run the exact same number of impressions, well, just to go back and look at these 4 ad impressions, right? We're going to serve 1 million impressions in ad number 1. Because remember, to your point, we can't get around the 135 bid requests on impression number 1. Because to get rid of that would potentially damage the publisher because we want to make sure the publisher has the maximum number of bids for that ad so that they can increase their revenue and their yield. But once we've got that user targeted, we can serve up the additional ads with far fewer bid requests.
Yeah.
So let's just say we serve up 1 million impressions here, right?
Yeah.
We will typically see about 300,000 impressions in ad slot number 2 on average. We'll probably see about 200,000 in ad number 2 and another 100,000 in ad number 4, which means that we've just gotten to 1.6 million impressions. We just delivered 600,000 of them with these sequential low carbon impressions. And so when you go back to comparing Sequency to the baseline to a standard campaign, well, how many fewer bid requests did we have? So instead of 216 million bid requests, we were able to do it with only 135.6 million bid requests.
Yeah.
And then if you measure the emissions associated with that, it's only 255,000 grams of CO2 equivalents.
Yeah.
That ends up being about a 38% reduction in emissions. You run a baseline campaign, you compare it to a sequencing campaign, and there's your reduction.
So like real world application of reduction type technology, right? Rather than taking measurement and applying the campaigns and trying to kind of like optimize. You're saying here's a product that actually can reduce your carbon footprint by 38%.
And increase the viewability.
And make you money.
Well, increasing the viewability of the advertising. And, viewability is an important metric. It's not the only metric.
Yeah.
But we want to get more third-party measurement of this product from every possible source that we can.
Yeah.
We want the Lumens of the world to be measuring the attention behind it. We want the Double Verifies and the IASs and the Moats of the world to ensure that the viewability metrics are in line with what we see.
Yeah.
And
from a buy-side perspective.
Right.
And
then all of the different companies that are now providing measurement of emissions in media, we think that this is going to score really high because based on our calculations, we're dramatically reducing a really big component of the problem, which is the data waste that comes from the bid request.
Yeah. Just quickly though, on the yield, because it's really important to talk about this, from a publisher yield, you're also increasing revenue.
Well, we just created impressions that didn't exist before. Now, again, you make a good point that each one of these impressions is still requiring at least 1 bid request. It is not 0. But if these were impressions that were going to be refreshed anyway, it's a much better approach to refreshing.
Yeah.
We're trying to get publishers to sell more quality impressions.
Right.
And less low quality impressions.
Yeah.
Higher viewability is going to skew more towards higher quality. Higher quality allows them to have higher yield and drives more value for the advertiser.
So you're basically helping the buy side, reduce carbon footprint, increase the value, like increase sort of the impact of campaigns. I love the idea of like sequential messaging here. That's a very smart thing. But the flip side, you're also helping the publishers make more money because you're able to do, you're able to sort of like add more inventory or add more sort of revenue, incremental revenue that they didn't have before.
Well, there's something else happening with publishers too, right? As publishers are now starting to get ranked based on new criteria.
Exactly.
Right? Publishers are getting squeezed a lot of times.
Yeah.
Sometimes they're showing up on a list, and maybe it is the carbon impact of a publisher, and a publisher might just find themselves on the wrong list. Maybe they've got too long of an ads.txt file. Maybe they've got too many integrations, and suddenly they're now getting left off of media buys. We want to go to publishers and say, hey, here's a really powerful message to send back to your buyers who are increasingly looking for green media products.
Benchmarked. Remember that we were talking about it yesterday. Agencies now are benchmarked against lowering the corporate, and likewise brands pushing it all down. We want to be able to use less power to serve ads. So.
We are, media and advertising is a supply chain. And if you go back to the economic buyers, these 17 of the 25 companies that have set a science-based target, they've all got goals. They've all got objectives in terms of the kinds of companies that they want to work with. Mm-hmm. And this is the sort of thing that we in this supply chain need to be thinking about when our clients, our economic buyers, are looking at ways to reduce emissions from their various supply chains. We're a supply chain. We are partners of these economic buyers. We need to be constantly thinking of ways that we can go back to them and say, we've still brought you the value that we've always been bringing. We're trying to make sure we hit the right KPIs. But if we're able to do that and still contribute to your bigger emissions reduction targets, then we're just adding value to the whole ecosystem.
What's the reaction been so far from buy side?
Buyers love this because, I mean, first off, there's a lot of CMOs that are now, they have objectives around their
100%.
sustainability goals.
We keep telling
right?
people they all get bonused on how much they can reduce their carbon footprint.
So there's a need, there's a real appetite for the green media solutions that are out there, and so we think that this is definitely a good one. And to your question,
GMS, Green Media Solutions, I like it.
Sure, there's been a lot of great interest from that, and there's a lot of buyers that want to that are expressing a lot of interest, that are testing it out, and the publishers love it because, to your point, they see it as a way to generate green inventory, low carbon inventory. But again, they have to be coming up with solutions that they can bring to their buyers, and we want to be able to provide that to them.
Brian, brilliant distillation of the problem and a great run through the product that's addressing this issue. Thanks for your time today. That was a great run through the product, and just buy Duration Media. It's good stuff. So Brian,
Thanks,
we'll see you next time.
All right.